Diane Ravitch is the president and co-founder of the Network for Public Education. She's an historian of education and research professor at New York University. Diane blogs, as you probably know, at dianeravitch.net, and her blog has surpassed 36 million hits. She has written 11 books, including her latest book, Slaying Goliath. Michael Hynes works as a public school superintendent of schools for the Port Washington School District. I love it. He always writes that. He works as a superintendent of schools. He doesn't identify himself as a superintendent of schools. And I think that's really neat. Michael is a Fulbright specialist and an associate professor of education and leadership on Long Island. His mission is to spread the message of the importance of a holistic approach to educating children. Dr. Hynes is a former assistant superintendent, principal, and of course, a teacher. Thank you so much, Michael and Diane. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Carol. It's great to be back. And I guess the first few times we did this, we just had photographs. And the reason for that was that I couldn't get a haircut. So let me explain that a friend visited with hair scissors and she gave me a haircut. And then she confessed to me that she had never cut anyone's hair before. So I now have this new look called the choppy short look, done by an amateur. But welcome to our talk. It's wonderful to be back. And it's wonderful to be with Michael Hynes. I've admired Michael's work for a long time. And I recently read his new book, Staying Grounded. And it's a very interesting book. It's about educational leadership, but it's really about everybody. And it's about his philosophy of what's most important in schooling. And I wanted to talk to Michael because he has a very different vision of what schools might be, should be, can be. And as a district superintendent, first in Patchogue, Medford, and now in Port Washington, he's been able to take his ideas and apply them. So I hope to get Michael to talk a bit tonight about how, first of all, what his vision is, how he's brought it to life, and how he gets away with it. Because most superintendents in this country, and there are probably close to 15,000 of them, feel that they have so many mandates and regulations that they can't break the chains that bind them. And so I'm going to ask Michael to start off with to talk a bit about his philosophy of how do we educate our children for the world that we live in today. And this is not a simple question, so I don't expect you to give a nutshell philosophy in a few sentences, but just as a beginning of the conversation, talk about some of your ideas and what you think is most important for parents and educators to think about right now, other than the pandemic.
Sure. Thank you, Diane, and Carol, and Darcy and Marla. It really is a pleasure to be here. It's actually an honor, Diane, to have a conversation with you. And before I answer that short but profound question that I think many of us are grappling with, I want to thank my Port Washington community, certainly my Board of Education, because that is part of the answer, by the way, how you get away with something. It's you have to have a Board of Education that is really, that puts the child at the center, puts the student at the center of everything that they do. And my amazing Board of Education in Port Washington certainly does that. And as we all know, for the past several months, this has been something that has nobody ever expected. Now, we were just talking about offline. It's like everybody's working 24/7. Even if you're not working, you are on 24/7. And that takes a toll on your body, on your mind, and everything else. And so that's really what I want to talk about, because it's really figuring out what the purpose of school is. You know, and I ask that question all the time, like, what is the purpose of school? And again, it sounds like a simple question, but I could almost, and I'm going to use an old football term here because I love the New York Jets back in the 60s, Joe Namath term. I can guarantee you that if I asked, let's say, 100 superintendents or 100 parents what the purpose of education is, we probably would have 100 different answers or close to that. And I think it's imperative that we have one answer, or at least some conditions that are relatively the same. And so for me, the purpose of school is really, it's about, for an educator, creating those conditions. I know Ken Robinson talks about it all the time, right? How do you create these conditions, these optimal conditions for children to grow and to learn? And how do we maximize the talents and potential of kids? And that sounds very generic and very 30,000 feet up in the air. But the reality is, in my humble opinion, my estimation is that we've lost sight of that. We don't really have a North Star as much as we should. And we need to make that a North Star. And for me, it all begins on an inner journey, getting to know ourselves. I think during this pandemic, a lot of us, whether we liked it or not, we are getting to know ourselves and probably our families, maybe a little bit too much, depending on who you are and where you live. But the reality too with that is that it's all about wellness. And this is what I learned when I was in Finland with someone, I know you know, Diane, Bill Doyle. I was fortunate enough to go with Bill for, gosh, more than a week, and spend at least 14, 15 hours a day, not only in the schools in Finland, but getting to talk to everybody, from the gentleman who runs the whole education department and down to the parent and to the teacher. And basically it comes down to two things for them. They trust their teachers inherently. Like, they hold teachers to the highest regard. Like, they are as good as it gets. And they're trained very, very well over there. Not that they're not trained well here, but they're trained, like, you know, as Bill would say, like NASA astronauts. But the second thing is there that I found really interesting and resonated with me tremendously is the focus on wellness. Like, what gets them up in the morning is to figure out ways to physically, socially, emotionally, and cognitively be engaged. It's not about taking tests. It's not about, you know, how did I do today compared to yesterday? How am I compared to my neighbors to the left or to the right, or to a different state? It's about being better than where you were yesterday, and to have the ability for children to self-assess. There's a lot of autonomy. There's a lot of self-directedness. And so part of my educational thought process and philosophy is how do we take those things and sprinkle them into this new norm of what we have here in the United States? And so anyway, that's probably my 5-minute answer as far as my philosophy. It's about wellness. It's about focusing on physical, social, emotional, and cognitive capabilities and talents, and creating those conditions to maximize student potential. And I know we can do that. It's hard to do it right now remotely, that's for sure. But I believe, I hate the word silver lining, that's getting played out. We need to, and we can, shift this tanker ship more than 5 degrees. I really believe this is an opportunity to really focus on the basic needs of all of our kids.
So, Michael, I had the pleasure of visiting Finland as you did. I was there in 2011, and it came about after I met Pasi Sahlberg, and he invited me to come and visit, and then he took me around. And I was, like you, blown away by the emphasis on creativity, on physical movement, on recess, on making sure that all children had at least 2 meals and maybe 3 meals a day. And test scores, not so much. I mean, it's astonishing to Americans to hear that Finland does extremely well on international assessments, and the kids don't take tests, standardized tests at all. And I remember my first exchange with Pasi came about when we were at the Finnish consul's home having lunch to discuss the PISA results. And at that time, Finland was #1. I think they're #2 now, but they don't care. And I said, how do you hold teachers accountable? And he said, in Finnish, we don't have a word for accountable. We have a word, the closest word he said would be responsible. And our teachers are very responsible. We don't hold them responsible. They hold themselves responsible. Right. So it's a very different outlook. But your comments lead me to ask a question that I'm sure everyone who's watching would also ask. How do you deal with the standardized testing, the great monster?
Yeah, it's, you know, boy, and I know you know about this, the AP debacle, right, with the tests, as far as what happens, right? It's almost like you can almost set your watch to it, where something is going to come And it's just bad for kids when it comes to that. Yeah, how do you deal with that? I think you deal with it on a multiple levels. You know, in my previous district, the community there that we were serving, the parents were very educated as far as their choices, you know, the choice to take the test or not take the test. And at some point, the opt-out rate where we were was close to 80%. I mean, 80% of a student body not taking a standardized test in grades 3 through 8 is remarkable. And it wasn't just 1 year, it was several years. So it wasn't like, you know, this anomaly that took place. And I really believe the power of community. If a community really wants something for their children, they will get behind it as long as we educate them. And that's part of it, is including the parents in this process, including the teachers in this process. And I really do believe at the local level, we talk about our boards of education. They are extremely critical because they represent the community as far as what the wants and needs are. And so I think that is one edge, that is for sure. But there are so many, you know, it's like, it's not even salmon swimming upstream. It is very, very difficult, as you say, the monster. I call it the College Board monster too, because that behemoth, it's like a Godzilla monster, right? It's just, it's been around for quite some time. It calls the shots on everything. And for many places, for many institutions, it's like the end all and be all. Like, you know, if kids don't take 5 AP classes or 4 AP classes a year, and I'm not saying that it's all bad, by the way, but it's like, you know, if they don't do it, they won't get into a great college, and especially if they don't score a 4 or a 5. We have been fed this narrative for a very, very long time that if our students aren't testing well, and I think Pazzi definitely would agree with that, and certainly Sir Ken would too, it's only a sliver of what they're doing and what they're capable of, and yet that is all we solely focus on. So how do you get rid of it? I think, you know, clearly the parents have a lot more say than what I think, or power than what they believe. I believe the power of school boards. I believe the power of superintendents and principals and teachers. You know, if we can all band together and say, it's not just because we all believe students have to be assessed. I mean, students are assessed all year long by our teachers, formative, summative. The teachers are practitioners and they know how to assess where kids are, right? So that's not the narrative. Like it's not like we don't believe in that, but there are other ways that we can showcase how kids are growing over time. And we have to start focusing on what those possibilities are. And I would really love at some point, whether it's in New York or in another state, for us to learn from other countries around the world that are doing things in a much different way, having wonderful results, and always keeping the student at the center. How is it that in Finland, the school day is shorter, right? The school day is shorter. The school year is shorter. So the day is shorter, the year is shorter. Many students are speaking 2 or 3 languages by the time they're in 3rd grade. It's not because they're smarter, and believe it or not, it is diverse in Finland. I think people have this notion that everybody has blonde hair and blue eyes, and it snows all year long there. That is not the case. There are lots of things we can learn in other countries that we have to bring back to where we are and actually try to figure this out, because now I believe the watch has been set for us to create that new norm and that new narrative, and it doesn't rise and fall on standardized tests.
Well, it's interesting to ponder whether it's possible to break free of this. What struck me is that we're almost in a kind of a psychological zombie zone, where in the election of 2000, George W. Bush said there had been a Texas miracle. And the miracle was based on testing every child every year from grades 3 through 8 and releasing the results. And then the schools would either feel thrilled or they would feel shamed. But whichever it was, the results were test scores go up, graduation rates go up, achievement gaps close. But it's 20 years later, and we now know there was no Texas miracle, but we're still stuck with this hoax. Which it was. It was a, you know, election year. People say all kinds of silly things, and they don't mean them. And in 2020, when there was all the talk of the Texas Revolution, it was a fraud. But why we're still living with this fraud, and we can't seem to break free of it. I mean, No Child Left Behind was widely reviled, and yet it should have been revisited in the normal course of events, either in 2005, 2006, 2007. It didn't get changed until 2015 because our senators and congresspersons are simply incapable to imagine schooling without high stakes testing. They can't think of it. And, you know, I know that you're a mindful person. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about how do you break the mindset, a mindset which is actually very damaging. I mean, think about somebody who thinks that every day I should cut my wrist, every day I should self-mutilate, every day I should bang my head against the wall. And then how do you convince them that this is actually harmful, stupid, and you should stop doing this? This is where we are with standardized testing today.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing to do is to change somebody's mind, right? I mean, I think it's very hard to even change your own mind sometimes, but to change somebody else's mind is profoundly very, very difficult, and especially when there's a collective bunch that believes something to be so. You know, the best way I could think about it is, you know, it starts with a school, then a school district, then I believe a region, and then a state. And I am waiting and I'm hoping that at some point a state education department, whether it's New York, whether it's somewhere else, actually looks to redefine, again, going back to the original conversation of what the purpose of education is. And I really, really believe if the right people are on board, and it starts small, it has to be organic. You know, nobody likes to be told what to do. There's no doubt about that. I think it's part of the human condition. Nobody likes that. But we have to give autonomy to schools and give them different choices as far as how to do things in a much different way. Listen, the fact that New York State, for some reason, believes that we need 5 exit exams or over 4 exit exams for a child to graduate. Now, whether we believe, whether it's here in New York, that the Regents exams, I'm not saying that they're bad or good, because I think there is a place for them. But there are different parts of New York State, especially in the Big Five, right? Whether it's New York City, Syracuse, Buffalo, that has a consortium school model. It's one example, an exemplar of what can be, and we need to showcase and learn from that. The consortium schools, they have what, over 18, 19, 20 years worth of data to show that that type of model does work. I think we also have to focus on the fact that, forget standardized testing, but if we go back to CTE programs and not every student has to go to college in order for them to be a success. You know, for some, you talk about narratives that have to change over time. There's so many different spokes on that wheel. Standardized test is one of them. But the fact that all children, if they don't go to college, then their lives are ruined for the rest. I just don't buy it. And so when it comes to the trade schools and students using their hands to work for a living, that narrative has to change. Why are we married to ACT and SAT? Like that is the holy grail. If students don't take that test and if they don't score at a certain rate, then they won't get into the best college. There are so many different mindsets, you know, we're talking about Carol Dweck and different thought processes that we're just married to. We have to break a lot of them, but for me, it starts with an organization that actually shows a model that you can scale up over time. And so I think whether it's standardized testing, whether it's believing the fact that all these different things that we talked about, there's a lot of things that need to shift. But at the center of all of the shifts is the teacher and the student. And those two things are so linked together that we have to make sure that everything we do, every decision we make, has those two particular components in mind.
So to shift just a little bit to the present and the situation we're dealing with today, how is this remote emergency learning working, or distance learning, whatever you want to call it, depersonalized learning? How is it working out in your experience in your district?
Wait, did you say depersonalized learning?
I call it depersonalized learning. I mean, if you're communicating with a computer, it's not personalized. It's the great fraud of the reformers to call it personalized learning, when in fact it is depersonalized learning, taking the teacher out of the classroom and having a communication via a machine.
I just wrote that down, so I hope you don't mind. I'm with your name next to it. I like that a lot. It's been difficult, and I, to be honest with you, I think it's difficult in a lot of different places. Forget the equity and access issue, which I think is paramount. That is number one, right? So regardless of what program a school district has or a school has. If students don't have access to A, the technology, or B, Wi-Fi to engage with that teacher in that depersonalized learning atmosphere, it's impossible to move forward. I mean, the fact of the matter is when schools shut down in mid-March, many of us were building this plane in the air, which is never a good thing, right? Many of us were taken off guard. And so to develop something over time, in a short period of time, in a compressed timeline, is very, very difficult. I have to say our teachers here and our administrators here did a remarkable job, really, in a very short time, coming up with something that I believe was a good start, which is making sure that everyone had access, everyone's being fed. Right? That's the other thing we have to think about too. And then to make sure that teachers, from a professional development standpoint, had the ability to grow, because again, like anything else that's out there, there is a continuum, right? There are certain educators that from a technology standpoint, it's part of their DNA, and they can utilize it the way it's meant to be used, in a way to support, not supplant, but to support what they're doing. But there are some educators and some administrators for sure, where it's very difficult to do that. So you're doing all this at the same time, and you're developing a plan, and you're making sure privacy issues are handled. And it's very stressful. It's very, very difficult. But I applaud not only our students, but our teachers, but our community. And right now, it comes down to, I think the most important part of this is the contact time. A lot of our students and a lot of our teachers, I think it's very hard to argue against the fact that, forget the learning that does take place, but just like you and I are having this conversation right now, it does so much for the brain in a positive way, in a very negative, potentially negative space. So how has it been? I would say it's been challenging. I think we definitely have some successes, but there are things that we definitely have to augment and some things that we have to shift with. But it's been a real learning experience, because as you know, and I listened to your conversation with Randy last week, which was a really insightful conversation for sure. I learned a lot, is that we have to plan for September. And Diane, when you are exiting a school year, right, for the first time without actually physically being there, and hearing about seniors and missing all those milestones, it's very emotional, it's very difficult as you're closing out a school year. And at the same time, you are planning for the new school year, because parents want answers, and rightfully so. And the board wants answers, not just ours, but every board, because we want to be prepared. And so that leaves a space of uncertainty in many ways. And nobody likes to live in uncertainty for too long, because that can be toxic after a while. And I think the most important thing we can do as a school district is to, no pun intended, is to stay as grounded as we can. Not get too high, not get too low, and to really try to strike a balance between the two. And I think that's the trick in all of this, is to figure out where that balance is with remote learning, or as you said, depersonalized learning in some ways.
Please steal it and use it as often as possible. I assume that you're planning now for the fall. And I wonder, I know we had this conversation with Randy, but I think a lot of things are uncertain, because none of us knows what the fall will bring. None of us knows where we'll be. And it's hard to plan when you don't know what the circumstances will be. It seems likely that there will not be a vaccine. It seems likely that there will continue to be a virus, and there will continue to be infections, maybe not as many as there are today, hopefully. And there will continue to be danger, both to students and staff. How are you planning?
Yeah, so, and I believe a lot of school districts are doing this right now. They're coming up with their own task force. And with that task force, you have to make sure that there are representatives from all different facets of your school community. So, of course, you want to have teachers on board, you want to have administrators on board, a board member, but you have to have nurses, you have to have custodial staff, you have to have security, right? And when you break up into subgroups, you want to make sure you have parents on board as well, as well as other parts of your school community. And so that's where we are right now. We are developing a task force to plan for that. But I think just as important, Diane, and I know you know this because you talked about it last week, this is budget season right now. So you talk about the perfect storm of an F5 tornado and a Category 5 hurricane converging right now, all in one place. That's where school districts are, at least in New York State they are, where for the first time ever, they're developing a budget, not only remotely, but now they're mailing, community members have the ability to vote from home, from the comfort of their living room. And so you have more people now than ever watching not only budget conversations, which I don't think is a bad thing. I actually think it's a really good thing for them to be informed. But as far as what budgets, as far as them passing, we don't know. And because of the way the governor has structured some of these budget votes, what happened is, or what may happen is, because you have the ability to, if a budget is voted down, to put it up again a second time. We don't know if we're going to have a second time in New York State because of how tight that timeline is. And so a lot of that has to do with, planning. You have to have money for these things. And I know, again, you talked about it last week. It's very hard to do any of the things that we're talking about if the funding isn't there. So if the federal government doesn't come up with the money for New York State for them to then trickle down to the school districts when it comes to state aid, it is really going to be a very tough go come September, for sure.
Well, this is the part that in my conversation with Randy and other conversations I've had, I won't say confused is not the right word, but not able to understand, on the one hand, the imperative of social distancing, meaning fewer children in a single classroom. So instead of having 28 or 30, there should probably be 14 or 15.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, dramatic budget cuts. How does that work?
I don't think it does work. I don't think you can have both. I just don't see how that's going to happen. Listen, I'm fearful that some school districts, because then we're talking about the potential reduction of state aid on top of that, right? So, I know Governor Cuomo about a week ago was talking about the potential of a 20% budget cut for school districts. And so if you take that coupled with the potential of a budget going down and then having to buy masks potentially, right? Or doubling transportation routes and then trying to social distance and have an AM and a PM session or Saturday sessions. I mean, that just costs vast amounts of money, and you only have X amount of teachers. So yeah, that is the Rubik's Cube that has been broken, and we need to figure it out very, very quickly. I think for us right now is what we are trying to do, and I think many superintendents are doing this, is focus on the things that they can control, because it's very easy to get sucked into and caught up with all the things that we can't. And if we focus on what we can control, which is the people that we have in our communities to develop plans and to have contingencies for each plan, that's the best we can do at that particular moment. And then to figure out ways, of course, to fund those things. But right now, I would say, and I said this at a budget meeting, a couple of days, I think it was last night. They're all blending together now, all these different days and nights. The next 3 weeks for many school districts will determine the next 3 years of what's going to happen. And so it is really critical that communities communicate, school districts communicate with their communities, as far as what the budget is and what the potential downside is if a budget does go down, with what a contingency budget actually looks like. And so these are pretty scary things, but I really do believe this brings people together. This is when I believe school communities can rise, they can shine, and they could make something better than what they had before if all of the arrows are pointing in the right direction.
So would you say that there is an opportunity or almost a mandate right now for parents to communicate, which is a polite way of saying it, with their legislators to make sure that the burden of this downturn and of this budget disaster is not borne by the children? I mean, it seems to me that every legislator ought to say there has to be another way to cut. There has to be a different way of raising money to make up for the downturn. But the children should be first, not last. Not first to be cut, but first to be protected.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And yes, I think parents, they can and they have to. I think they really, it's part of their responsibility at this point. And I know parents are stretched in so many different directions right now. And as a parent myself, my wife and I, who are educators, trying to, you know, have our kids learn at home. It's, you know, I had that dramatic pause because it is a real challenge to work and to make sure your children are being educated at home. But we're also, like, because we know what's happening, the economic downturn, there are a lot of communities where either their workload has been reduced as far as families, or they don't have any work at all. So, and that's where the budget comes into play, because many school districts, and I think our school district did a tremendous job, is making sure that we are honoring the taxpayer by making sure the levy is not too high, and then making sure programs and students, really students because of the programs that support them, are at the center of a school budget. So the same thing, I think, if you extrapolate that and you scale up, it's the same thing for our legislators. They have to make sure that there is like a do no harm policy to all of our kids when it comes to not only this budget cycle that is just incredibly difficult, but then when it comes to September. September is going to be very interesting because we don't even know how many parents want to send their children to school with all of this uncertainty. It's very difficult. And you're right. I mean, socially, first of all, how do you socially distance a kindergartner or a pre-K student? I can't even fathom, you know, trying to keep 4, 5, 6-year-olds apart from each other. It's so counterintuitive, you know, to their being as far as what that looks like. But, you know, again, and I know you keep up on this, you look at what's happening in Germany, what's happening in other countries right now, and what they're trying to do. Listen, when I see pictures, I think it's in Tokyo, 5, 6, 7-year-olds with masks on, with hats on, and they have these things going out to make sure that they're not touching their neighbors 6 feet apart. I mean, is that really school? I really don't know. But we also know, too, that parents have to work. You know, we also know we have to honor that fact that, you know, parents need to have an income in order for them to survive. So this is quite the balance that we all have to deal with right now.
Well, I guess that one of the things that's missing is leadership. We don't have, I mean, I know that Governor Cuomo gives great press conferences about the progress or regress of the coronavirus, but what we have had very little of nationally is a strategy, a plan, a call for social solidarity, a call for people to stick together and protect one another. And instead, we're torn between, on the one hand, people saying, look, there are scientific principles here at work. We have to take care of the children. We have to take care of each other. And on the other hand, we have these protesters running around saying, open everything up. We're not wearing masks. We're not social distancing. And I feel like I don't know what country I'm living in when I see that, when I see armed protesters storming the state capitol in Michigan and saying, take away all the restrictions, or a state court and the Supreme Court in Wisconsin just struck down the governor's efforts to impose restrictions and said it's not his job. Well, whose job is it? You know, it's like everybody's on their own. And I'm reminded of Betsy DeVos speaking to the organization, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, which is a very far-right group that doesn't believe in government. And she said that she talked about Margaret Thatcher, who had said some years back, there is no such thing as society. There are individuals, there are families, there is no such thing as society. Well, when you're in the middle of a pandemic, we really need public leadership. We need to have coordination, a coordinated response. We need to have guidance from the CDC that's sensible. And what we have right now is chaos. So I know that makes your job even harder. But let me pivot just a little bit and ask a question that should be a softball question for you. You are famously different from most superintendents because you're not a toe the line kind of guy, but you are very sensitive to well-being and to mindfulness and to the importance of play and to whole child education and child-centered education. So my question to you is, how'd you get to be this way?
Wow. That's a really great question. How did I get to be this way? You know, when I started out as a 3rd grade teacher, I'm a much different person when I started. But I think my basic essence is I'm still a kid. I'm still a child. And And I mean that in the most sincere way. I remember what it's like to be a child. And one of the things I do often, not only as a superintendent, but I did it as a principal, Diane, is I shadowed students all the time, often, because I think what happens after a while, if you're removed from childhood, you forget what's important and what they need. So for me, I make sure I am always, it's always reinforced why I'm here. And part of that has to do with school should be a joyful place. And it hasn't been like that in a very long time. When I started in the mid 90s, I was able to teach in a much different way than certainly after No Child Left Behind. But basically what it comes down to is really my thinking and really contemplating, like, why are we here? Aside from the fact that it's mandated by law for kids to be educated from a certain time period, right? From X age to Y age. But I always grappled with the fact that we have lost sight of the purpose of why we are there as educators, and because of the mandates, and usually it's because of, I be careful how I say this, but about leadership. Like, whenever I was a teacher, I always thought I can do a better job than the principal, not because I was really great. It was because I never agreed with them. I never agreed with handcuffing teachers and not allowing them to collaborate and to share ideas and do all these different things. But the reality is, Diane, I mean, I really love kids. I understand developmentally. I think we've lost sight of developmentally understanding where kids are, whether we believe what Piaget said or Erik Erikson said, or we believe what Maslow believes, and as far as getting to the pinnacle of self-actualizing. All those things, I think we don't integrate nearly enough within our schools. Kohlberg, as far as moral development, all these different things that we have lost sight of, and I've always held in the forefront of my mind and heart that this is what we need to do more of. And I don't know. I love playing with kids too. I mean, gosh, I have so many of them at home. I'm reminded of it all the time. The bottom line is we learn the most as adults and as children through play. I mean, that is the reality. It's, as Mr. Rogers would say, Fred Rogers, it's the highest form of learning in many ways, right? I mean, we really, really remember everything that we do through that. And so, I don't know. I just don't think it's rocket science. Everything we're talking about, it's really not rocket science. The rocket science is getting it implemented and getting people to, going back to your second or third question, how do you get people to change their minds? And I think you can do that over time. I really do believe that, because if you can't, then why are we even here? Why are we even having this conversation?
Well, it's about educating the public, and it's about not necessarily, I think probably most of the people who are watching tonight are watching because they want to hear what they believe in what you're saying, and they want affirmation. They're not here to have their mind changed so much as they are to have someone tell them, yes, what I believe is right. And here's somebody who's got a lot of experience, and he's supporting what I've always believed. I can't help but remember a time where when I wrote this book about 10 years ago called The Death and Life of the Great American School System, in which I sort of publicly announced that I had been wrong for many years and that I had turned against testing and choice. And the book is very supportive of teachers and the importance of teaching. And I went out on the road and talked about it, and teachers would come up to me literally crying. And I became friendly with a woman named Jan Ressiger, whose column or whose writing often appears on my blog. And Jan was like the education and social justice minister of the United Council of Churches. And I said, I don't understand this. Why are people so emotional? And she said, because you are affirming their truth. They already know this. They don't have to be convinced. This is what they believe, but they're in a system that doesn't believe it. They're in a system that every day says to them what you believe is wrong. They're in a system that says that the only thing that matters about a child is his or her test score. And you know that's wrong. And so what you're doing, appearing tonight, is affirming to people that you as a district superintendent and someone who's relatively outspoken, has managed to maneuver through the rough waters of going from being a teacher to a principal to a superintendent, and you're still there, you're still standing. They haven't managed to knock you off yet. And so a lot of people, I think, are looking for the leader. Reasons that I find you so interesting, Michael, is that you speak up and you're not afraid, and people need this so much because we live in a time where I think we're surrounded by robots and zombies. And I always talk about ideas that have been tried repeatedly and failed every single time as zombie ideas. And standardized testing, which is used to stigmatize children, which is used to undermine instruction, which is used to narrow the curriculum, which is used to encourage cheating, and which is used to rank children, is very harmful. And so you would think at some point, the people who are imposing these policies might stop and say, we're not going to do this anymore, but who's going to be the first one to speak up and say so? So I think that you just have to keep talking, and you have to keep talking about the things that matter most, because there are a lot of people out there who need that affirmation. You are affirming their truths. And I worry about the upcoming generation of teachers. And I know that you're a professor as well as a district superintendent. And I worry about the pipeline of teachers. Or have we now, after 20 years, so brainwashed teachers so that unless they're older, they don't understand that there is another way of being a teacher other than the prescribed way? What's your hope for the future in terms of rebuilding this teaching profession so that people can teach authentically and teach with children first instead of the standards and testing first?
Yeah, well, and thank you for what you just said. I very much appreciate it. I worry about our future teachers, that's for sure. I mean, I think about, coming into this climate, it can be very difficult, but I have to be honest with you. Part of the reason why I wrote the book, it really does come down to the leadership within the schoolhouse and the school building, right? So I believe if there is a principal or a teacher leader who maybe supervises in some capacity, for them to be, I believe, to be very grounded and to be collaborative and to understand what teachers are going through, and for them to be part of the process as far as decision making. I really do believe a lot of these things rises and falls. I know John Maxwell and others say this all the time, but it's true on leadership. And so I have hope for teachers if we have the leaders in the schoolhouses and in school districts that allow them to flourish. As Ken Robinson would say, climate control versus command and control, right? We don't want command and control. It's funny, what's in Finland, Diane, there are no superintendents in Finland. Like, I almost had a heart attack when I went there. I'm like, I need to get out of here. There are no superintendents. But the reality is, I believe if we had teachers who we believed in and we supported, as well as paraprofessionals and everybody else who's part of this journey, it touches the lives of kids. And we are there because someone asked me, like, what is my job? You know what my job is? My job is to make sure you get everything that you need and deserve, so our kids get everything they need and deserve. It really comes down to something like that. So I have hope for our teachers. I will say it's a little scary right now, but I always, the reality is, through trials and tribulations and struggling, you always come out that much stronger. And I really believe teachers will be more resilient, but we need school leaders to really understand that our job is to support them, very much so. And the other thing I think we need to really have a firm understanding is mental health, mental wellness. It's something I am profoundly passionate about, and I'm worried about it at the same time. You think of all the toxic stress and all of the trauma that has taken place over the past several months. You talk about professional development, not just for teachers, but for all educators and for everybody who touches the lives of kids. They need to understand what being trauma informed and what we can do to support not only our kids, but our families. That is going to be the next edge and the next thing that we have to focus on. I totally believe in a whole child education, but now we really have to focus on much more as far as mental health and wellness, and the stigmas that are attached to it, and what we can do to support that, because that will be the new norm coming back in September. So yes, we may have the staggered classrooms and kids in masks and double the transportation, but we will have a lot of students who have experienced trauma that we have to be prepared for.
Well, you said earlier that you've heard too much about silver linings. I actually haven't heard a lot about silver linings, but I do think that one positive, maybe two positives that will emerge from this era is, first of all, I think parents have a new appreciation for teachers. I think that they understand how difficult teaching is, and they really value the expertise and the experience of the people who can stand in front of a group of 25 or 30 young people and command their attention, and inspire them and encourage them and know their names. And I've heard from so many parents, they say, I have 2 or 3 and it's impossible. It's impossible. I can't even teach 3 kids at the same time. How do they manage it? And of course, the parents, most of them, or many of them, are working online themselves, so that they have the double responsibility of being both parents and teachers. But I think that the other thing is that there's a renewed appreciation for the role of the public school in the community, because people are seeing the public schools taking on so many responsibilities, not just providing the remote learning, but also coordinating the availability of internet access and access to the machines themselves, and then being the center where people turn when there are issues with mental health or physical health. So there are many, many roles. And I would like to say that this will lead to a very different set of circumstances when school one day fully resumes. But every day in my email box, I'm bombarded with siren calls from people selling technical stuff.
Oh.
And saying, oh my goodness, this distance learning is so great. Now everyone's going to do it. We're all homeschoolers now. We don't need schools anymore. Or as Governor Cuomo famously said a few days ago, why so many physical buildings? And I'm waiting for him to vacate his mansion. Why does he need a physical building? He has lots of physical buildings. But the idea that he would bring in Bill Gates and Eric Schmidt from Google to reimagine education, when we know that these are guys who are hammers looking for nails, and any solution they come up with is going to be tech. And I think right now parents would be thrilled just to have human-to-human communication and have their children in front of a teacher who knows what he or she is doing. So I think that it's not necessarily a silver lining, because I believe there is a hunger for school to resume, and at the same time a great fear of human contact. So it's all kinds of complicated things happening right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there is a renewed appreciation for teachers and what they do, because what they do really is not only the best. It's not a job, it's a calling. I really do believe that, and there's an art and a science attached to it. And yeah, listen, teaching your own kids is much different than teaching somebody else's kids. That is for sure. But the reality is, one of my biggest fears too is that we go back to the way it was in some ways. And when I say the way that it was, from a community standpoint, in some ways, that we think teaching is less than, like, we think teaching is easy and we don't need public schools and school choice, all these different things. And that is not the case. We are, I believe, only as good as the schools that the public has. And I also want to, say this too, and it may not be very popular, but, I think one of the things I've learned over the past 20 plus years, when I take my horse blinders off and I try to learn from others, we do have homeschoolers out there. We have all these different ways of learning. There are Montessori schools, there are Waldorf schools, there are parents who homeschool for whatever reason they choose to, and I do honor that and I respect that very, very much. But the reality is, the public schools in our communities are vital for the future of this world, as far as I'm concerned. And so some of the things that we have to think about, whether it's the future of what it looks like for public schools and for education as a whole, we have to future forward in some ways. And we think about, I read something somewhere by 2030 that there'll be all these different automated jobs that'll take away, I don't know, like 800 million jobs, right? And so I think of, if that's even remotely true, what does that mean as far as what we're doing in schools? That means, that we have to make sure what we're doing, we can't compete with machines. I don't want us to compete with machines. What we have to do is make sure that we are different than machines and we don't turn into them. And the best way to do that is to focus on how we are different from machines. And you mentioned it before, Diane. It's about creativity. It's about empathy. It's about, divergent thinking, all these different things that we need to really start focusing on within our schools that we can do, I believe, with a new narrative of what will come once this whole thing is over, and it will be over. I think George Harrison sang a long time ago, all things must pass, right? This will pass at some point. You don't want me to sing it, that's for sure. But I will say this, it will pass. And so what happens after this passes is what I'm looking forward to, because I really believe we will be better for it.
Well, I'm not going to draw you into the political struggle, but I will say that American education is typified by lots and lots of choices. As you point out, there's homeschooling, there's religious schooling, there's a million different ways you can be educated, including, self-education, which is very important. The real critical political issue is whether public money will be taken away from public schools to pay people to homeschool. There are actually states that, I don't know if they've done it yet, but they want homeschoolers to get tuition, which, sort of defeats the whole purpose. And there's a major Supreme Court decision that's going to be coming down fairly soon about a family in Montana that wants their religious schooling paid for by the public. And if that decision goes against the public schools, then every religious school in the country will be able to get their tuition. Every child in a religious school will have their tuition paid for out of public funds. And that's going to be yet another blow to public education.
Yeah.
If you think about the numbers, 85 to 90% of the kids are in public schools.
That's right.
So why would we rob these schools to support private choices? But that's where we are today. In the few minutes we have left, I'd like to ask you, Michael, if you could tell our viewers and listeners about your new book, Staying Grounded, because it's where we began. And I think it's very interesting because I was surprised to see that your first principle for school leaders was take care of yourself.
Yeah.
Eat well, exercise. And, that was not what I was expecting in a book about school leadership.
Yeah, actually it sounds kind of weird. I agree with you. But the reality, again, for those of us who are parents out there, right? If we are not functioning at a very high level, and the best way to do that is to make sure we take care of ourselves. So if we want to lead others, it's very hard to lead others if you're not taking care of yourself. You're not leading yourself, as far as, and it sounds selfish, right? It's like, I'm going to take time for myself. I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to eat well, or I'm going to, get more sleep, at the expense of something else. But actually, I think it's one of the most unselfish things you can do, because that means you have more to give of yourself when you take care of yourself. And, there's that story, and it's true, of an airplane, right? The first thing you're told in an airplane is to put the oxygen mask on yourself, not your children. You're like, well, that doesn't sound right, but it's true, because if you don't take care of yourself, you won't be there for your children. So that is something I learned the hard way when I first started out, is I did not take care of myself at all. And we need to do that. And so that is rule number one, because all the other 11 principles, as far as I'm concerned, don't matter if you are not there to assist others. So that's why I led with it. But it's broken up into 3 different parts, Diane. It's the inner journey. I think a lot of us don't really take the time to get to know ourselves. I talk about the power of routines. I think routines are incredibly important. I like to study, whoever we think are successful, in other areas, right? I always love to learn from others. And one of the things I learned is that they all have routines that they abide by and follow, even on the weekends, believe it or not. And it keeps structure in place. And like anything, it's like a paradox, right? Like the more you have routine, the more flexibility you have in other areas. And I think that's incredibly important. And it's very easy, I think, as a school leader to not take care of yourself and to not have routines established. But so that inner journey is incredibly important. And then I talk about the outer journey, as far as what we need to learn. I believe some of the things that we've lost sight of over time, and I mentioned this before. I think every school leader needs to shadow a student. Now, it's hard to do that now in this time, certainly, that's for sure. But if you have the ability as a principal or an assistant superintendent, assistant principal, or even a superintendent for the whole day, not for a half hour photo op, but to actually spend a day with a child. It's like kindergarten cop. You're shoving an IV drip in your arm after a full day. You're like, I'm done. I don't know if I can do this again. But that's the thing, right? So if all of our decisions are about kids, then it's important that you reacquaint yourself with what you're building and what your structure is that you have in place, because it impacts that greatly. And then the last thing I really end with is, the future, as far as what we should really start focusing on. And I really start talking about the people I think, I talk about emotional intelligence and IQ and cognitive ability. And yeah, I mean, it's always nice to have, cognitive abilities, that allow you to be, smart in certain areas, but emotional intelligence and understanding the different facets of what it means to have a high emotional intelligence, to work well with others, to be empathetic, all those different things. And again, to take that inner journey is incredibly important, because that is the new narrative. That is the new norm. That is the new world. I know a lot of smart people who can't work with anybody. That's a kind of a difficult way to make a living and to live. And so I think that's incredibly important that we understand how important it is to have both of them. So that, to me, the book is broken up into 12 principles. I'm hoping, after however long it takes someone to read, if they can take one or two and apply it, because it's broken up into different parts too, how I have chosen to use it and how you may want to, test drive it. I always say, why don't you just test drive it for a month and see how it goes. And if it sticks a little bit, I think ultimately in the end, which is the most important, not only will it benefit you, it'll benefit the kids that you're serving.
Well, Michael, I think you are a true revolutionary of our time, and I hope we'll see much more of you in the future. And I thank you for all the great things you've done for the kids you've interacted with, and also for the inspiration that you provide for the rest of us. And I know that Carol and Marla and Darcy have some questions and are prepared to field them. And thank you for being here to talk with us.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Diane.
Thank you very much, Diane and Michael. Now we're going to go ahead and open up with questions. So Marla, if you'd like to begin.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. My name is Marla Kilfoyle. I am the grassroots liaison for the Network for Public Education. Again, an honor to be here with Mike and Diane. We've got a ton of questions and I don't even think we're going to be able to get through them. So we'll try. Anyway, the first question is, actually, we'll throw this to both you, Mike, to both you and Diane, please. It's from Joan Mosley, and Joan asks, there are many of us in education who are very excited about the opportunity to reimagine education as a result of this unfortunate crisis. What are both of your thoughts on that?
Michael, I'll let you go first since you're out there on the firing line.
Well, thank you. So reimagining education, that is, I've been waiting for this, I think, my whole life, to be honest with you, because reimagining education is really, I think, clearly defining what the purpose is, which is what I was talking about before. I think right now reimagining education has to do with how do we figure out ways to do things that we've always wanted to do, but we never had the ability to do it because of a whole host of different reasons. And part of it has to do with, I think, really focusing on two things: problem-based learning and project-based learning. I think if we could develop more opportunities for kids to develop those, the ability to have those types of interactions and learning opportunities, I think that is going to shift things tremendously. The other thing is, I think that we have to focus on a whole host of things. Four in particular. One is we have to have kids move more than what they're doing right now. Movement is incredibly important, you know, and there's so many books out there to support that. Spark is one of my favorite books. I think it's by John Ratty, I believe. He's a doctor, and it shows you how important and it shows you the research as far as the more movement we have throughout the day, and I certainly saw this in Finland, the better, the more primed kids are to learn. So we need to really think about what that means. The environment within the school, it's so amazing when I think of some of the schools that I visited internationally, what the classroom looks like, how important the furniture is, how important the construct of a building looks, what it has for students and for staff. I'm not even going to mention the faculty room in Finland because it's like going to a five-star hotel. But the fact is, if we have environments that are conducive not only for the staff that's there, but certainly for our kids, you know, it primes them to learn. So all these different things that we could now, I believe, take advantage of. The environment is critically important. And the last thing I'm going to say, which may sound a little weird, but I'm throwing it out there anyway, nutrition is incredibly important. We need to have our kids and our staff fed in a much different way than what we're doing right now. And how do we do that? I'm not saying everything has to be organic, but there is the science behind what we eat and how it affects us, not only mentally, but physically and in every other way. We have to think about how we can design that within our schools and make that happen. I know Dave Gamberg does a lot of this out in Southold. You know, we have gardens. He has gardens out there. I could talk about Dave Gamberg forever, but the reality is, we need to think about a few different things, do them very well, and then let's focus on a few other things. If we focus on 30 different things all at once, it's like a prism in light. It's fractured, and we'll get nothing done. So I think we have to prioritize. We have to focus on a few things, but all of it, I believe, has to focus on student and staff wellness.
I'm glad you mentioned David Gamberg because I've spent the last 20 some odd years living in Southold, where he's the superintendent. And he puts a major emphasis on the kids gardening, raising vegetables that they eat themselves and eat in the cafeteria. He puts a huge emphasis on music, and there are many different musical groups in the schools. And performance is very important. They have a Broadway show every year that would knock your socks off. That these kids, who are basically from high school, but not only high school, they have junior high school kids, even elementary school kids. The last one I saw was Les Miserables. I couldn't believe that a small school district could put on a show like this. And play is really, really important. He unfortunately is retiring this year, but I hope that his legacy will live on. The reimagination that I would like to see is a reimagining of the federal role in education. It started in 1965 with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and the purpose of that act was equity. And the mechanism of that act was funding the poorest schools. And over the years, it grew and changed and added more and more parts, special education, funds for kids with limited English proficiency. Many other programs were added, but the heart of it was equity and funding. It's now become the vehicle for mandated testing, and it has been for the last 20-something years. It's time to reimagine the federal role in education, to restore, in my view, its original purpose of being a funding mechanism to make sure that the poorest kids have and their teachers and their communities have the funds they need. And I think it's also crucial in the larger scheme of things, beyond education, to recognize that the most important determinant of outcomes in education is the home. And that means that we really should reimagine the tax code so that we don't have so many people worth billions and billions and billions of dollars and other people living at the margins of poverty or in dire poverty. I mean, I go back a long way, so I can remember in America where there was a booming middle class, and our goal was to someday eliminate poverty. And we seem to have given up on that entirely. So we have now almost half the kids in the country qualify for free or reduced price lunch, and no one seems to be very disturbed about that. So I'm hopeful that in the reimagining, it becomes a reimagining that goes beyond schools, certainly includes schools, to focus on the things that matter most to kids, but also to think about a society where people feel that they have a chance and feel that that life is fair. And I think that we're right now a society where there's a great tolerance for unfairness and a willingness to accept that some people are lucky and have billions of dollars and other people are unlucky and have nothing. And I don't think that that's not the kind of America I want to live in. So I'd like to see that reimagined too.
Great. All right, our next question is from Arthur Kamens.
Oh, hi, Arthur.
Hi, Arthur.
And Arthur is throwing this one to Mike. He said, one of the problems we face is that many teachers and administrators have come to accept the belief systems about assessment that gave rise to No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top, even when they reject the testing regimen. Have you had success in shifting those beliefs in your school district?
It's a great question. I think it's situational. I think in pockets, in its totality, no. But you just have to keep plugging away at it. You know, in my previous district where I was, I think, you know, there was a collective will to push back against some of the things that Arthur just brought up, for sure, standardized testing and some other things. And so when you have a collective bunch doing that, it does make it a little bit easier to try to turn the tide, so to speak. As I move into a new school district and get to know the community, you know, all these communities are different as far as what they want and what their expectations are. But the reality is, you know, for me, and I think for many superintendents, is that question, whether it's here in New York State or it's in other states, it's the state education department. Like, we need some strong leadership, I believe, there. You think about what's happened in New York State, right, over the past X amount of years as far as commissioners, and far be it for me to judge anyone. That is not my role, but we need strong leadership there, working with, you know, well, just the leadership team with the regents. And I believe that the state education department, as bureaucratic as it is, in all 50 states has an opportunity collectively, if they so choose to do so, to make a dent and to make a difference in not only standardized testing, but a whole host of things. I know Diane talked about equity. That is one of the biggest crimes, actually the biggest crime out there. When you drive across this great state of New York, or even Long Island for that matter, where the tracks literally divide the haves and have-nots. I mean, it literally, you see railroad tracks do that. And so I just believe that there is a lot of influence there that needs to be moved forward in a very positive way. And so I think superintendents can do it in pockets, but I think we need leadership from up above to work with us in order to make that happen.
Great. And that's going to lead me to a question. And Diane, I'm going to ask you to answer this first, and then I'll have Mike come off after you answer it. This is from Melanie Purificato. And Melanie asks, how do we change the minds of administrators and superintendents from focusing on standards and testing to authentic teaching when there is so much pressure placed on them? And especially out here on Long Island, where we have high performing districts, which have high property values, which are sometimes based on test scores. So Diane, how do we change the minds of administrators and superintendents to focus more on authentic teaching and less on testing and standards.
Well, I would love to say that they should have a conversation with Michael Hynes, and they should all read his book, Staying Grounded, about what matters most. And they, you know, it's, as he said, it's very hard to change people's minds. I guess I would look at it from the other end of the telescope, which is if we could somehow persuade our members of Congress to rewrite the federal law so that it no longer required annual standardized testing, if we could make the case that no high-performing nation in the world tests every child every year from grades 3 through 8, and that we are isolated in that, and that it has been totally ineffectual. I mean, if you test every child every year on the assumption that test scores are going to go up, and then you look around and you say, test scores have not gone up. They've not gone up nationally. They've not gone up for the state of New York. They've not gone up in many states. And in most states, they're completely flat, and they have been for almost 20 years. So we have to, I think nothing will change until we can get our congressmen and our senators and members of the House of Representatives to recognize that this has been a vast waste of money. We've spent literally billions and billions of dollars that's gone to the test makers. And in the meanwhile, we're starving our schools and our children. And this has been a fruitless pursuit of higher scores because it's failed. And so, but you can't break the chains without going to where the chains are, and the chains are in Washington, D.C.
Mike, what do you think about?
Boy, I could talk about this forever. The thing is, and this is what I would love to see more of, is principals and superintendents taking more risks, which makes them very vulnerable, unfortunately. And I get that. It's very hard to do. Sometimes you'll see in seasoned superintendents who have been around for a while, they're more apt to do that because, you know, they can do that, and they feel like, you know, if they make a mistake, they can live through it. But when you're a newbie and you're getting to know your community or your board, and you're still getting to know the position, it can be hard to do. So one of the things I've found is I want our educators and our administrators to learn how to test drive things. I'm not saying here in Port Washington, I'm saying in general. Like test drive things and see if they work, right? So I'll give a very quick example. When we doubled recess in my previous school district, and I'm mentioning this because, you know, I always, you know, people like, how can you do something like that? Because that means you're teaching less, and that means kids aren't learning as much, right? So, and we're shaking the head because that is not the case, right? More of something doesn't mean it's better. And I always say, you know, if I take a lot of vitamin B12, you know, it's toxic after a while. So I like to say, I want you to try things new and see if it works. And believe it or not, and this is where I get into trouble, but, you know, I'm here, so I'm amongst friends. I'm going to say it. Play, believe it or not, the more kids do play, and as Peter Gray would say, it's self-directed play, where fifth graders can actually play with first graders. You know, they won't get locked up if they do that. That's actually very healthy. And you allow those opportunities, you know what's going to happen? Test scores are actually going to go up. You don't focus on the test scores, but the fact that kids are learning new and different things, and they're not learning content per se, but they're using different parts of their brains, which allow them to, if that's what you care about, that's what gets you up in the morning, is higher test scores. So I would like to see our principals, you know, it's not test prep. I don't know if there's a real strong correlation between the more you test prep kids, the higher the scores will be. I actually think it's just the opposite. And if you maximize that time and you utilize that time and you allow teachers and principals and other people who work within the school to try things and to create those conditions to do it, I believe you're going to see test scores go up, even though that shouldn't be the reason why you're doing it. And so that is what we have to do. So I totally agree with what Diane said, because it's true. You know, these handcuffs that we do have, you know, are there 3 through 8 testing because of what's happened. But in the meantime, I always like to think, again, we focus on the things we can control. There are a lot of things we can control within the school day, but a lot of it is, can we put our egos aside as school leaders and allow people to try new and different things and see what happens at the expense of the possibility of test scores maybe not going up and even staying flat, which is not cataclysmic, and we will live if that does happen. But there is this love affair, as Diane said before. We like to rank and sort kids. We like to rank and sort schools, and that just has to end. That goes nowhere. All it does is pit communities against other communities, states against states, countries against countries, and that doesn't make anything better at all.
Great. I'm going to weave together two questions because they're kind of similar. They're from William Weinstein and Dr. Al Pisano. So William says, Dr. Hynes, you're such an advocate for wellness. Do you have any thoughts on how performing art ensembles may look in the future? These groups are very critical to nurturing the whole child and offer outlets to develop their social and emotional health. But music ensembles face unique problems like a large class size, close proximity, and of course, the blowing of instruments, for chorus and band. Yep. And Dr. Pisani says that given the fact that we're going to be tied to technology and remote engagement in the near future with the potential occurrence to COVID-19, what would then be your vision for the future of school, social, emotional, academic, and digital? So we have a couple questions there. How do we advocate for the arts, in specific the art ensembles, and what would be the vision for the future of our schools with the potential occurrence of another COVID-19 outbreak?
Yeah, so let me, well, I feel like I'm on a job interview. This is great. I hope there's a rubric for this and I get judged. So, I mean, this is really, really interesting because I think about this, right? You think about what students hold near and dear, whether they're little kids or they're seniors. And we have kids, clearly the arts are incredibly important, whether it's music and or art and dance, right? All these things are incredibly important. And for the most part, you're usually around a lot of different people when you're doing this. So anything that's performance-based, right? So art, music, sports is another thing. And a lot of our kids have been stripped of these opportunities. Now they can play in isolation, but they're clearly not getting the total benefit from that. So what does the future of art or music look like at this point? I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. And if I don't know an answer, I just say, I don't know. And I really don't know what the answer is. What I do know is that we have to figure out something very soon. You see these wonderful ensembles where kids are in a chorus, right? And it's like the Hollywood Squares, times 1,000, where you see these little boxes everywhere, right? And they're singing these beautiful songs, right? That's great. But it certainly doesn't, seeing and being part of an ensemble live and singing to an audience is a totally different experience. So what's going to happen, in September when it comes to that, I really, really don't know. I know that if and when we do it live, and I think we will in some cases for sure, we'll have a hybrid of things. I don't think it's going to be the extreme one or the other. I think we'll have a hybrid of a whole host of things. We just have to do it as we can and really slowly. But we can't strip it. Like, we have to make sure it's there. Just because we can't do it the way we did it before doesn't mean that we don't have it at all. And I think that's really one of the most important things that we have to never lose sight of. As far as Dr. Pisano's question, it's really a profound question, because the question becomes, what does future schooling look like? If you look at some of these schools around the world, and some of them are in public schools, a lot of them are learning not so much online, but they have, and I don't want Diane to get upset, but it's true, because I've seen it. They have these individual learning plans, not IEPs, but ILPs for kids, and a lot of them are technology based, meaning that their days are planned. It's almost like you have apps for your day, and your day is individualized as far as what you learn and how you learn it. That might be something in the future. I'm not saying September, But in some ways, we can never lose sight of the fact that the teacher is part of that experience, part of facilitating as far as whatever content in those experiences are. I think that is something in the very near future that can happen in pockets, especially if there's a second wave, because we have to figure out a way to integrate real teaching and learning if we can't be there physically. And again, and we touched upon this before, there's the social emotional aspect where teachers are just checking in, right? And I know so many teachers that do this. It's just a phone call or just a Zoom meeting or Google meeting just to say, how you doing? How are things going? What can I do to support you? How was your day? And then they leave. And then there are other experiences that are a lot more interconnected, a lot more interrelated in the content areas. I think that is going to be a major shift where we are not learning content areas in isolation. I think we will see how everything truly is interconnected, almost like what this virus did. This little thing shut down the world, right? In so many different ways, whether it's schools, whether it's the economy, so many different things, because everything is interconnected. And I think what's going to happen with future schools at some point is we're going to take that understanding of what the interconnectedness is from a technology standpoint and making sure that teaching and learning is part of that. But that's a whole nother conversation. And to be honest with you, I'm frightened of that conversation in some ways, because I don't want us to ever lose sight of some of the things we've been talking about for the past hour and a half.
Yeah. So if I can just throw in something, Marla, we've been focused on schools, but think about the implications of this pandemic for live performances in general. Mm-hmm. Think about it in terms of Broadway. How long is Broadway going to be closed down? How can anyone perform Oklahoma or My Fair Lady or any of the great musicals or any new musicals when no one can touch, when no one can sing within 6 or 8 or 10 feet of one another? How do we have symphony orchestras where people can't socially distance? What happens with all of our cultural institutions? I don't think we've even begun to process the extent to which this pandemic has turned our lives upside down. And things are not going to be the same soon. They may someday go back to what we used to consider normal. But frankly, and I think Mike's right, it's often best to say, I really don't know. But we can't just say that only somehow schools need to be reimagined. Everything needs to be reimagined.
It's true.
Because we're moving, at least for the time being, into a different world.
Great. And Diane, while I have you on a question, I'm going to give you this question here from Carl Rust. Because I know that you've spoken on this on a lot of Zooms that we've been in. How do we get kids and families more involved in planning and making policy? And that would go from the local to the national level.
Well, it's hard. It's hard to respond to what happens during a pandemic because we've never lived in a pandemic before. None of us were there during the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. So everything is different. But what I wrote about in Slaying Goliath was the way that kids and parents and neighborhoods, people just rose up and said, we're not going to take this anymore. And whether it was the opt-out movement in New York State, where the parents of 200,000 children said, we object to these tests. We don't like the effect they're having on our children. We don't like we don't like the content. We don't like the secrecy. We don't like anything. We're not taking the test. 200,000 kids. That's gone on now for several years. And now this year we don't have tests, but it's got nothing to do with the opt-out movement. But the opt-out movement was enormously powerful. And I wrote about kids in Providence who brought standardized testing, the idea that a standardized test should be a graduation requirement. They stopped that through their activism. Very creative, very playful, things that kids could do that adults would never even think about. So, the point I tried to make throughout Slaying Goliath was that activism is very powerful. Sometimes one person makes a difference. Sometimes a dozen people make a difference. And when I think of a dozen people, I think about G2 Brown. When Mayor Rahm Emanuel closed 50 schools in one day, and then he proposed to close the last remaining open enrollment high school in Chicago. And G2 Brown and his allies said, we're not going to let this happen. And they pursued Mayor Emanuel everywhere saying, save Diet High School. And he ignored them. And then they set up their little plastic lawn chairs on the campus of Diet High School. And they went on hunger strike. And 34 days later, Mayor Emanuel capitulated. And it was just 12 people, and they didn't have any money. They didn't have the Walton Foundation or the Gates Foundation or any other foundation. They just had themselves, 12 of them, and Mayor Emanuel gave up and put $16 million into renovating and saving the school because he couldn't take the protest anymore. So activism matters. I mean, people have tremendous agency that they're not even aware of. And that's, I guess, the message I wanted to get across was, you know, the Network for Public Education has, through the good work that Carol Burris has done and Darcy and you, Marla, we've tried to connect people to one another and show the power of people, which is the guys on the other side who want to destroy our public schools have lots and lots of money, but we have numbers. We have vast numbers of people. And when we activate the people who care the most, they don't need money. They just need to be there and to show up. And it's hard to do during a pandemic, but it can be done. Sometimes it can be done through emails, but there are lots and lots of ways to be active. And I'm sure that you, Marla, and you and Carol and Darcy, you're all over it. And we will continue to fight Betsy DeVos's destructive.
Yep. And this is Diane's book, if anybody's interested. Great book if you want to figure out how to mobilize, slaying Goliath. It's a must read. Mike, I have your book coming in. So we have just one more question, and we're running out of time a little bit, but this is also from Carl Rust, and he says, can Mike Hynes be the Secretary of Education for the United States?
Oh, I'll nominate him.
Diane knows the process. Carol, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you, everybody.
That's a great question and a great way to end. And you know what? If only it were so, Michael. If only it were so. So who knows? Maybe better things will be happening next year. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll be back next week. We will announce our next guest shortly. And remember also to pick up a copy of Staying Grounded by Michael Hynes. It will be a book that you will most certainly enjoy. Have a good evening, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.